This is a preview to day 1 for Unit 6. We are going to be working between radical and exponential form. So first off, if I gave you the square root of x, how would we write that in radical form? Well, first we want to think about what our index is. The number here is our index. If there is no number, it is a 2. To write an exponential, it's always 1 over the index. So for this one, if I have the cube root of x, what would my exponent be? You are right. Our exponent would be 1 over 3. This is our radical form, and then this is our exponential form. Your brain is going to want to work back and forth between the two forms depending on what is easier for the problem. If I asked you, what is the square root of 64? What would you say? That is right. The square root of 64 is 8. Well, now let's think about if we were to keep this in exponential form, what would it look like? If I have 64, what would my exponents be? Well, my index is a 2. Remember, if it's not there, it's an imaginary 2, so I have 1 over 2. How would I rewrite 64? Well, we can think of that as 8 squared, and that would be raised to the 1/2. The 2's cancel, and that simplifies to give us 8. Now let's also think about the idea of if we can have a negative under the radical. If we have an even index, can we have a radical underneath the a negative underneath the square root? So could I take the square root of negative 64? What do you think? Would we get a real solution? No, you're right. We would have an imaginary solution of 8i. What if I told you I want your answers to be real answers, real numbers? We would say this has no solution. We want to think of it then, if we had 64, negative 64 in parentheses to the 1/2, we have to make the connection that those mean the same thing. If we have an even index, and we have a negative base, and that negative is in parentheses being applied to that exponent, then we would have a no solution. Let's also look at the idea of a cube root. So if I said, what's the cube root of 8? Well, you might be thinking, okay, the cubed root of 8 is 2. And that is because 2 times 2 times 2 is 8. If we wanted to keep it in write it in exponential form to simplify, we have 8. What is my exponent? It would be 1/3. How would we simplify it in this form? We can break the 8 down as 2 to the 3rd, and that's being raised to the 1/3. Our 3's are going to cancel, and that would simplify to 2. Can we have a negative with an odd index? Well, let's think about that. If I have the cubed root of negative 8, we do get negative 2. Why? Negative 2 times negative 2 times negative 2 is negative 8. That works. The reason it didn't work above is if I have something being multiplied by itself. 2 negatives being multiplied by itself gives a positive, or 2 positives multiplied by itself gives us a positive. There is no way for us to multiply by itself and end up with a negative. However, when you have an odd index, a negative underneath the radical is okay. The next thing I wanted to discuss with you is the difference between a negative number and a negative exponent. If we have a negative exponent, do you remember how to work with those? Well, remember, we don't like to have negative exponents. We move them from numerator to denominator or vice versa. In this problem, we'd have a placeholder. So we want to make sure we always move negative exponents. Now, a negative number is different. If I have a negative 2x squared, a negative number is just fine. We don't have to move. And that is because the exponent is positive. So make sure you're always looking at the exponent to decide if it's negative and if it needs to move. Another quick review would be when we have two numbers, such as negative 4x to the 3/4 times 5 to the 2/5. Do you remember what we do when we're multiplying exponents? Negative number is just fine. That's because it's a number. It is not the base. Sorry, I forgot my x over here. When we multiply, we're just going to multiply our numbers, and we get negative 20. With multiplying, when we have the same base, we rewrite our base, and who remembers what we do to our exponents? We add our exponents. So 3/4 plus 2/5. Well, you can use your calculator to get a common denominator, or you can do that work by yourself, getting that common denominator of 20. So we'd have 15 over 20 plus 8 over 20, and that gives us 23 over 20. We do not have to move anything because this is a positive exponent. Remember, the negative in front is just a negative number.